The morning they nailed the notice to the post outside the Cattlemen's Bank in Harlan Creek, Colorado, Maude Easton read every word of it twice and felt something cold and final settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. It was the spring of 1882, and the notice declared, in the careful, looping script of Judge Orville Crane, that one Maude Easton, spinster, aged 24 years, was to appear before the Harlan Creek Territorial Court on the 14th day of April to answer the petition of Mr. Gerald Whitmore and Mr. Douglas Whitmore regarding the lawful disposition of the late Franklin Easton's estate, being the Easton Ranch and all its cattle, water rights and buildings thereon, located some 12 miles north of town along the Red Bluff Creek. Maude stood in the dust of the main street, her dark hair pinned neatly under her straw hat, her hands curled into fists at her sides, and she read that notice until the words burned themselves behind her eyes. Her father had died 6 weeks prior. Franklin Easton had been a big man, a quiet man, a rancher who had built his spread from nothing more than cracked hands and stubborn will over 30 years of wind-scoured Colorado territory. He had never remarried after Maude's mother passed, and he had raised Maude alone on that ranch, teaching her to read brands and mend fences and sit a horse the way a person sits something they love rather than something they merely use. He had left her everything. She knew he had. She had been there when old Harold Marsh, the attorney in town, had drawn up the documents, and her father had pressed his seal into the warm wax and looked at her across the table with those steady gray eyes of his, and said, without a great deal of ceremony, that she would do fine. But Franklin Easton had also died without telling his foreman, a lean and watchful man named Gerald Whitmore, that the rumors Gerald had spent 3 years cultivating about Maude's mental temperament were never going to find purchase in her father's estimation. Gerald Whitmore had worked the Easton Ranch for 7 years. His brother Douglas had followed him there 4 years later and worked the books, and together they had spent those years quietly convincing the men in Harlan Creek that Maude Easton was erratic, prone to fancies, unsuited to serious business, and certainly unsuited to managing a ranch of that size and value. They had been careful about it, the way a person is careful when they are building something meant to last. Maude had known, in the vague and unconfirmed way that a woman sometimes knows something without being able to prove it to another person's satisfaction, that the Whitmores did not like her having opinions. She had not known they had been building a legal case. She pulled the notice from the post, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside her coat. Then she turned and walked down the street toward the far end of town, where a man named Charles Talbot had recently set up a small law office in the back room of what had previously been a feed supplier's storeroom. She had heard about Charles Talbot the way a person in a small western town hears about most things, which is to say in pieces and fragments that did not quite add up to a complete picture. He had come to Harlan Creek 8 months ago, having previously practiced law in Denver. He was 30 years old or thereabouts, and he had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers in the territory considered not worth the ink it cost to file the paperwork. Someone at the dry goods store had mentioned him to Maude when she had been asking, in the weeks after her father's death, whether anyone in town might help her understand her legal standing. The woman behind the counter had looked at her with a kind of cautious sympathy and said that if anyone would listen, it was probably Charles Talbot, though she could not say what good he might do. Maude had not gone to him then. She had believed in those first weeks that common sense would prevail, that the will her father had signed would simply speak for itself. The notice on the post had corrected that belief. The door to Charles Talbot's office was a plain wooden door with a small painted sign that read Attorney at Law, C. Talbot, and below that, in smaller letters, All Matters Considered. Maude knocked twice and pushed it open when she heard a voice tell her to come in. The office was a single room with a desk, 2 chairs facing it, a long shelf of law books that looked genuinely used rather than decorative, and a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. Charles Talbot was sitting at his desk with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading something closely enough that he had to set it down and blink at her as though reorienting himself to the room. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall even sitting, with dark hair that needed cutting and dark eyes that were attentive in a way that struck her immediately, that focused quality that made a person feel they were being genuinely seen rather than merely looked at. He had a good, open face, the kind that showed what it was thinking without being theatrical about it. He stood up when she came in, which she noted, because not every man in Harlan Creek would bother. "Miss Easton," he said, "I heard about your father. I am sorry for your loss." She realized with a small start that he knew who she was, and she was not sure why that surprised her. She sat in the chair he indicated and laid the folded notice on his desk. "They are taking the ranch," she said. "I need you to tell me whether they can actually do it." He picked up the notice and read it without speaking for 2 full minutes, which she found she respected. Some men would have skimmed it and started talking. He read it to the end and then set it down flat on the desk and looked at her. "This is a competency petition," he said. "Gerald and Douglas Whitmore are arguing that you are not of sound judgment to inherit and manage the estate. Under territorial law, if a court finds in their favor, the estate would pass to the nearest male relative or, in the absence of one, be administered by a trustee they could petition to have appointed, which in this case would likely be one of them." "I am of perfectly sound judgment," Maude said. "I know," he said, and the directness of it was so uncomplicated that it took her a moment to absorb it. "Tell me what they have been saying about you." So she told him. She sat in that plain chair in that plain room with the afternoon light coming gray through the alley window, and she told him about the years of small corrosions, the times Gerald Whitmore had contradicted her in front of the hired hands, the times Douglas had quoted figures back to her father that subtly misrepresented what she had said, the way they had each, separately and together, built the impression of a young woman who was ruled by feeling rather than sense, who could not be trusted with a ledger or a decision. She told him about the time she had caught Gerald altering the cattle count records and had told her father, and her father had confronted Gerald, and Gerald had convinced Franklin Easton that Maude had miscounted. She told him all of it steadily, without her voice breaking, because she had been trained by a life on a working ranch to carry weight without making a production of it. Charles Talbot listened. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a pencil, and he asked clarifying questions that were sharp and precise, and that showed her he was tracking every thread of what she was saying. When she was done, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "The will is valid," he said. "Your father's signature is witnessed and notarized. What the Whitmores are doing is attempting to use a legal mechanism that was designed to protect genuinely incapacitated individuals, and instead apply it to a woman they want removed from property they wish to control. The words they are using in this petition are erratic, prone to emotional excess, unsuited for independent decision-making. Every one of those words is a characterization, not a fact. Every single one. Can you prove that in front of Judge Crane?" she asked. He met her eyes, and the look he gave her was honest rather than merely reassuring. "I believe so," he said. "But I will need everything you have, every document your father signed, every record you kept, every correspondence, and I will need you to be willing to stand up in that courtroom and speak." "I have been speaking," she said quietly. "Nobody in this town has been listening." "I will be listening," he said. Something shifted in the air of that plain room. It was not dramatic. It was more like the moment a candle catches and steadies, the small certainty of a flame deciding to stay. "Then I suppose you have a client," she said. She rode back out to the ranch that afternoon under a sky going purple with incoming weather, and she thought about the way he had said every one of those words, with a measured precision that told her he had already begun to care about the outcome, not just the case. The Easton Ranch was a handsome spread, even in grief. The main house was a solid two-story structure her father had built from timber and stone, with a wide porch facing the mountains and a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke even when the stove was cold. There were 3 outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a proper barn with a good stone foundation, a smokehouse, and a well that had never run dry in 30 years. There were 600 acres of deeded land and grazing rights extending further, and along the lower pasture, the Red Bluff Creek ran clear even in August, which was the kind of thing that made land worth fighting over in Colorado. Maude walked the fence line that evening after putting her horse up, as she had done every evening since her father died, because the fence line needed walking, and there was no one left to do it but her. One of the hands, a young man named Perry who had been with the ranch 4 years, had stayed on after the death. The others had drifted, the way hired men do when they are not sure who is in charge. Gerald Whitmore had been making it clear, through implication and posture, that he expected to be in charge shortly. He was sitting on the bunkhouse steps when she came back from the fence line, and he watched her cross the yard with that measuring look he had always had. "Miss Easton," he said. His voice was smooth, carefully calibrated. Gerald Whitmore was perhaps 40 years old, with a thin, careful face and the kind of stillness that looks like patience but is actually something else. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and kept walking, "I wonder if you had a chance to see the notice in town today." She stopped and turned to face him. "I did." "I want you to know it was not done with any personal enmity," he said. "Douglas and I were thinking about what is best for the ranch. Your father built something valuable here. It needs proper management." "I managed this ranch alongside my father for 24 years, she said. "As a daughter," he said, "that is a different thing than managing it alone." She looked at him for a long, level moment. "Is it?" He nodded, with the expression of a man who believes he is being kind. "It is a great deal of responsibility for a woman on her own. We are merely asking the court to ensure the proper arrangements are made." "I have an attorney," she said. "His name is Charles Talbot. I expect you will hear from him before long." Something flickered in Gerald's expression, brief and quickly controlled. "Talbot," he said, "the Denver man." "That is correct," she said, and went inside and closed the door. She sat at her father's desk that night with the ledger books open around her and a lamp burning low, and she began making a list of every document, every record, every scrap of correspondence that proved what she was, which was a woman who had known this land and this business as thoroughly as anyone alive. Charles Talbot arrived at the ranch 2 days later on a roan horse with a saddlebag full of papers and the kind of focused energy that reminded Maude of weather moving in off the mountains, purposeful and carrying something with it. They worked at the kitchen table for the better part of 3 days. He reviewed every ledger from the last 5 years with the care of a man going over sacred text, cross-referencing figures, making notes, asking questions that were always exactly the right question. Maude watched him work and felt, for the first time since her father's death, that the ground beneath her was not simply going to slide away. He was good company in a way she had not expected. He was serious when seriousness was required, which was most of the time, but there were moments, usually in the late afternoon when the work had been long, and the light was going gold through the kitchen window, when he would make a dry and understated observation about some legal absurdity or some particular piece of Whitmore's logic, and she would laugh before she quite intended to, and he would look at her as though the sound of it pleased him. On the 3rd evening, they were sitting across the table from each other, with the ledger books pushed aside and cups of coffee between them, and he was explaining his strategy for the hearing. "The petition relies on 3 categories of claim," he said. "The first is that you are emotionally unstable. The second is that you have no practical experience managing the ranch's finances or operations. The third is that a woman alone cannot maintain a holding of this size, and therefore the estate will suffer." He looked at her steadily. "I am going to take each of those claims apart." "How?" she asked. "For the first, I will bring testimony from people who have known you and worked with you and done business with you." For the second, I will use these ledgers, which you kept or co-kept for the last 3 years and which are meticulous. For the third, I will argue that what the Whitmores call practical concern is not a legal standard. Capability is the standard, and incompetence must be demonstrated with evidence, not assumed on the basis of a person's sex. Maude wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him. You make it sound reasonable. It is reasonable, he said, with a slight edge to his voice that told her the unreasonableness of the other side genuinely bothered him. What they are doing is not. Judge Crane, she said, you know him. I know his record, Charles said. He is not a bad man, he is a conventional one. He will follow the law if the law is presented to him clearly. A pause. Which it will be. She believed him. She noticed that she believed him the way she noticed the solid sound of the stone foundation under the barn as something structural that she could orient herself around. Mr. Talbot, she said. Charles, he said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself. Charles, she said, and found she liked the word. Why do you take cases like this? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the surface of the table. My mother, he said, was widowed when I was 12. My father had a business. His partner disputed the transfer of it to her. She lost. He looked up. She was not incompetent. She was simply alone and without anyone who knew the law standing beside her. He said it plainly, without dramatizing it, but the weight of it was there. Maude looked at him for a long moment. I am sorry, she said. So am I, he said. Which is why I do this. They looked at each other across the table in the lamplight, and there was something in the air between them that was quieter than tension and warmer than professional regard, and neither of them named it, because there was work still to do, and the hearing was 12 days away. In those 12 days, Charles rode between town and the ranch with the regularity of weather, always arriving in the morning and staying until the evening, and Maude began to structure her days around his presence in the way that a person does when they are not quite aware they are doing it. She found herself making coffee before he arrived, found herself noting when she heard his horse in the yard, found herself looking at the road from the kitchen window. She told herself it was simply the anxiety of the case. She was not quite honest with herself. Perry, the young hand who had stayed on, watched the whole thing with the alert neutrality of someone who considers it his business to notice what is happening on the ranch he works for. He made no comment, but he made sure Charles's horse was always properly watered and fed when it was in the yard, which was his way of registering an opinion. Gerald Whitmore watched from a greater distance and registered a different kind of opinion. He rode to town more often in those 12 days, and Maude knew, without needing to be told, that he was meeting with his brother and with whoever was representing them, building the case against her. Douglas Whitmore had not appeared at the ranch since the notice was filed. He kept the books from his lodgings in town, and Maude had quietly requested that all ranch correspondence now be directed to her rather than to him. Gerald had delivered this request to Douglas with a face that expressed nothing, but Maude noted that the financial documents for the previous quarter had not been returned to her despite 3 requests. She told Charles, and he wrote a formal letter the following morning that was polite in its language and absolute in its legal authority, demanding the return of the documents within 48 hours under threat of a motion to the court. The documents arrived the next afternoon, delivered by a young man from town who looked like he wanted to be elsewhere. Maude went through them at the kitchen table that evening with Charles seated beside her, and within the first hour they had found what she had long suspected. 2 years of figures that had been subtly adjusted, cattle sales recorded at prices slightly lower than the actual price realized, with the difference unaccounted for. How much? She asked, her voice steady. Charles did the calculation in the margin of his notebook. Over 2 years, approximately $340. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. That is a separate matter from the hearing, he said carefully, but it is significant. It is theft, she said. Yes, he said, it is. He looked at her profile in the lamplight, and she saw in his expression something that went past professional concern, a kind of righteous anger on her behalf that she found more comforting than she had anticipated. "We will address it," he said. "Not all at once, one thing at a time." She nodded and turned back to the books. Their shoulders were almost touching at the table. Neither of them moved away. The night before the hearing, Maude did not sleep much. She lay in her father's house listening to the creek in the darkness and the wind moving through the pines on the upper slope, and she thought about her father sitting at this same kitchen table 30 years ago with nothing but deeded land, and the conviction that work and honesty would be enough. She had always believed the same thing. She was not certain the world had ever agreed with her about it. At 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs and lit the lamp, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her hands folded before her. She sat there for a long time, and she did not pray exactly, but she spoke to her father in the quiet way she had begun to do in the 6 weeks since his death, addressing him the way she might address the land itself, with directness, and without expecting an audible answer. She told him she was going to fight for this. She told him she was not going to let them take it. She told him in the unguarded privacy of 4 in the morning that she had found someone who listened. Charles arrived at the ranch at 6, which was earlier than she had expected, and she had barely finished braiding her hair when she heard his horse in the yard. She came out onto the porch, and he was already unsaddling, moving with the efficient calm she had come to associate with him. He looked up at her. The morning was cold and clear, the mountains showing their teeth against a pale sky. "You did not sleep," he said. "It was not a question." "Not much," she admitted. "Neither did I," he said. He tied his horse to the rail and came up onto the porch, and they stood together for a moment looking at the mountains. "I went over everything again. We are ready." "Are we?" she said. He turned and looked at her fully. "Maude," it was the first time he had used her first name, and they both felt it. "I have done this before. I have argued against this kind of case before. And what I can tell you is that the cases I have lost were lost because the evidence was not there. The evidence is there. It is all there. Every word they have used against you I can answer." She looked at him standing in the pale morning light, tall and certain, and carrying something she recognized as genuine conviction. She felt the cold stone in her chest shift slightly, not disappearing but loosening. "Then let us go," she said. The Harlan Creek Courthouse was a 2-story frame building with a false front and a bell that nobody ever rang. Built in 1876, when the town had been ambitious enough to want a permanent-looking legal institution. The courtroom on the 2nd floor could seat perhaps 40 people in its pine benches, and by the time Maude and Charles arrived at 9:15, most of those seats were filled. She had not expected that. She stopped on the stairs and looked out at the assembled faces and felt the air go thick. Charles, who was 2 steps ahead of her and had turned back when she stopped, came back down 1 step and spoke quietly. "They are here to see what happens," he said. "That is all. Let them see." She squared her shoulders and walked in. Gerald and Douglas Whitmore were already seated at the respondents' table, with a lawyer named Hollis Crane beside them. Hollis Crane was no relation to the judge, which was the sort of coincidence that Harlan Creek enjoyed enormously. He was a round-faced man with elaborate side whiskers and the complacent expression of someone who has won enough cases to believe winning is simply the natural order of things. He did not look at Maude when she entered. That in itself told her something. Judge Orville Crane was a gray-haired man of about 60, who had the look of someone who had seen a great deal and been mildly tired by most of it. He came in precisely at 9:30, settled himself at the bench, shuffled his papers, and looked out at the room with the unhurried authority of a man who had decided long ago that urgency was not becoming in a judge. "This court is convened on the matter of the petition of Gerald and Douglas Whitmore regarding the estate of the late Franklin Easton, specifically the question of the fitness of Miss Maude Easton to inherit and manage said estate as directed by Mr. Easton's last will and testament." He looked down at his papers. Mr. Hollis Crane will represent the petitioners. Mr. Charles Talbot will represent the respondent. Is that correct?" Both men confirmed it. "Then let us begin," said the judge. Hollis Crane opened for the petitioners with the smooth confidence of someone who has practiced his opening remarks in front of a mirror. He was good at it. Maude had to give him that. He painted a picture of an estate in danger, of a young woman well-meaning but temperamentally unsuited to the demands of independent ranch management, of a community's collective concern for an asset that had taken 30 years to build. He spoke for 20 minutes. He used words like fragile, impulsive, and unsuited with the careful deployment of a man who knows what he is doing. He called Gerald Whitmore first. Gerald took the stand with the ease of a man who has been planning this moment for some time. He was dressed in his best coat, his face composed into an expression of reluctant concern, as though he genuinely regretted the necessity of all this. Hollis Crane guided him through his testimony with practiced questions, and Gerald described a series of incidents, Maude realized, real moments from the ranch's history, refracted through a lens that transformed them. The time Maude had disagreed with his assessment of the spring cattle drive route became an episode of irrational stubbornness. The time she had wept at her father's bedside in the last week of his illness became evidence of an unsteady emotional constitution. The time she had challenged the cattle count records became an episode of confused thinking. He was careful, very careful, to present everything as concern rather than malice. When Hollis Crane finished, he sat down with the satisfaction of a man who believes the work is mostly done. Charles stood up. He moved to the front of the courtroom with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who is not performing confidence because he does not need to. He stood before the witness stand and looked at Gerald Whitmore for a moment that lasted just long enough to be felt. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "you have described Miss Easton as emotionally erratic. Can you give me one documented incident, one piece of written record, a letter, a testimony, a medical opinion that supports that characterization?" Gerald blinked. "It is more a matter of general observation over time." "I see. So you have nothing documented." "I have 7 years of working alongside her and observing her behavior." "You have 7 years of working for a ranch that Miss Easton now owns," Charles said evenly. "Those are different things." He turned to his table and picked up a sheet of paper. "I have here the ledger records for the Easton Ranch covering the period from 1879 to 1882. The pages covering these years, which include the cattle count records you just testified about, are in Miss Easton's hand." He handed the sheet to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. "Your Honor, I would ask you to note that the figures in these records are consistent with the official count records filed with the Territorial Land Office for the same period. Miss Easton's figures were correct." There was a small sound from the benches, the kind of collective breath a room takes when something lands. Gerald's face had not changed, but something behind his eyes had tightened. "Mr. Whitmore," Charles continued, "you testified that Miss Easton was prone to confused thinking. Can you tell me who kept the ranch's operational ledger from 1880 onward?" "She assisted with it. I have a letter here from your employer, Franklin Easton, written to his attorney Harold Marsh in November of 1880, in which he states that his daughter Maude, and I am reading his words directly, has taken over the bookkeeping entirely, and has done so with a clarity and thoroughness I could not better myself." Charles set the letter on the judge's bench. "Does that sound like confused thinking, Mr. Whitmore?" Gerald said nothing. "I am going to ask you directly," Charles said, and his voice had a quality that was neither raised nor angry but that filled every corner of the room, "because I want the court to hear the question clearly. In the 7 years you worked on the Easton Ranch, was there a single decision made by Maude Easton, a single one that cost the ranch money, damaged livestock, harmed operations, or demonstrated genuine incompetence?" A silence. "I would remind you that you are under oath," Charles said. "There were judgment calls I disagreed with," Gerald said carefully. "That is not what I asked. Not judgment calls you disagreed with. decisions that caused actual documented harm. Another silence. "No," Gerald said at last. The word came out of him like something small and reluctant. "Thank you," Charles said. "I have nothing more for this witness." He walked back to his table and sat down and did not look at Maude, but she could see from the set of his shoulders that he knew the room had shifted. Holly's Crane called Douglas Whitmore next. Douglas was smaller and smoother than his brother, with an accountant's careful manner and eyes that were always calculating something. He testified about the finances of the estate, speaking in the language of complexity and scale, suggesting that the ranch's holdings were beyond the realistic management capacity of a single woman. Charles, when he stood up, put the ledger books on the judge's bench one by one. "Your Honor, these are the original Easton Ranch ledger books for the years 1878 through 1882. I would ask you to note that the entries from 1880 onward, which coincides with when Miss Easton took over the bookkeeping, are consistently more detailed, more accurate, and more legible than the prior years, which were maintained by Mr. Douglas Whitmore." He paused. "I would also ask you to note pages 47 through 51, which cover cattle sales for the years 1880 and 1881. He turned to face Douglas Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, can you explain why the prices recorded in these ledgers for cattle sold to the Morrison stockyards in those 2 years are consistently between 4 and 8% below the actual prices paid, as documented by the Morrison stockyard receipts which I have here?" The room went very quiet. Douglas Whitmore's smooth expression did not shatter, but it developed a crack. "Clerical errors," he said. "Bookkeeping is not always precise." "The total discrepancy over 2 years amounts to approximately $340, Charles said, "and the systematic nature of the adjustment suggests rather more than imprecision." He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I would submit that this constitutes evidence of financial misconduct on the part of Mr. Douglas Whitmore, and I would ask the court to take this into consideration when evaluating the credibility of the petitioner's claims." Judge Crane was looking at the documents with an expression that was no longer tired. Holly's Crane half rose from his seat with an objection, and Charles turned to address it with a precision that was almost graceful, citing chapter and verse of territorial evidence law, and the judge overruled the objection with a small, decisive nod. Holly's Crane called 2 more witnesses, men from town who had known Franklin Easton and who testified, with varying degrees of conviction, to the general opinion that ranch management was difficult work and that it was hard to see how a woman alone could manage it. Charles addressed each of them with the same courteous, methodical dismantling. He asked each man whether he had direct knowledge of Maude Easton's capabilities. In each case, the answer was essentially no. He asked each man whether he was aware that she had managed the ranch's books for 2 years. Most of them were not. Then he called his own witnesses. Harold Marsh, the attorney, testified to the validity and contents of Franklin Easton's will, and to the letter he had received from Franklin Easton stating his daughter's capabilities. Perry, the young ranch hand, testified plainly and without embellishment to the daily operations of the ranch, and to Maude's role in directing them. The fence line walks, the cattle decisions, the negotiations with suppliers, all of it, delivered in the direct and unadorned language of someone who has no reason to say anything other than what is true. A man named Robert Colton, who ran the grain supplier operation in town and had done business with the Easton Ranch for 8 years, testified that in the 2 years since Maude had taken over the accounts he had found her more reliable and precise than the previous arrangement. And then Charles called Maude herself. She walked to the witness stand and sat down and looked out at the room. She saw the Whitmore brothers at their table, Gerald's face stone still and Douglas's not quite as controlled as he would have liked. She saw the people on the benches, ranchers and shopkeepers and their wives, people who had known her father, people who had known her. She saw Judge Crane looking at her with an expression that was finally fully alert, and she saw Charles Talbot at the table, looking at her with a kind of calm steadiness that said, simply and without performance, that she was not alone. She took a breath. Charles walked her through it. He asked her about her education, which had been conducted by her father from a range of books ordered from Denver and later from 3 years of formal schooling at the academy in Pueblo, where she had boarded and studied mathematics, literature, and natural science before returning home at 18 when her mother died. He asked her about the ranch's operations, and she described them with the comprehensive familiarity of someone who has been embedded in something for her entire life. He asked her about the ledgers, and she walked the court through the figures with the clarity of someone who understands numbers not as abstractions, but as the language of a living enterprise. He asked her what her father had intended. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. He intended for the ranch to continue, she said. He had built it over 30 years, and he wanted it to be managed by someone who understood it and cared for it. He chose me because I am the person who understands it and cares for it. Not because I was convenient, but because he genuinely believed I was the best person for the task. She paused. I am the best person for this task, not almost the best or close enough, the best, because there is nobody alive who knows this land better than I do. She said it without loudness and without defiance. She said it the way a person states something they have simply always known. Hollis Crane cross-examined her. He tried several angles. He suggested that the emotional stress of her father's death might be affecting her judgment. She answered that grief and judgment were not the same faculty, and that if they were, no one in the room would be fit to make a single decision for months after losing someone. There was a small, involuntary sound of amusement from the benches. Judge Crane did not suppress a look of mild appreciation. Hollis Crane suggested that the ranch would benefit from oversight and management assistance from experienced parties. Maude replied that she was entirely open to employing qualified ranch hands at the fair wages her father had always paid, but that oversight of the estate as a whole was her responsibility as its owner, and she intended to discharge that responsibility as she always had. Hollis Crane sat down. Charles stood for his closing argument, and he spoke for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes he dismantled the petitioner's case with the systematic care of someone who has built a structure specifically, so they can take it apart piece by piece. He said the petition rested on 3 claims, and that not a single one had been supported by evidence. He said that the word erratic had been used without a single documented incident to support it. He said that incompetent had been applied to a woman who had maintained the ranch's books with a precision her predecessor could not match. He said that unsuited had been deployed not as a legal finding but as an assumption, and that assumptions were not law. And then he said, with the calm and carrying quality that had held the room all morning, every word the petitioners used against Maude Easton in this petition, every single one was wrong. Not incomplete, not debatable, not open to interpretation. Wrong. Wrong in the sense that they cannot be supported by any document, any record, any credible testimony. Wrong in the sense that the only thing they demonstrate is a prejudice about what a woman is capable of, rather than any honest assessment of what this woman, specifically, has actually done. He paused. The law does not permit us to declare a person unfit on the basis of who they are rather than what they have done. This court has heard what Maude Easton has done. The court should rule accordingly. He sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Judge Crane looked at the documents on his bench for the better part of 2 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. I have reviewed the petitioner's claims and the respondent's evidence, he said. The standard for a competency declaration is clear, and it requires substantive evidence of inability to manage one's affairs. What has been presented in support of this petition amounts to characterizations, opinions, and generalities that are unsupported by documented fact. What has been presented in response is a comprehensive and credible record of capable management. He paused, and the room was so quiet that the creak of the building in the morning wind was audible. The petition is denied. The last will and testament of Franklin Easton stands as written. The Easton Ranch and all its holdings passed to Miss Maude Easton as sole inheritor. He looked at Gerald and Douglas Whitmore over his spectacles. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding the discrepancy in financial records, I am directing that this matter be referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for further review. Court is adjourned. The bang of his gavel was like something being sealed closed. For a moment Maude could not move. She sat in the witness chair, and she felt the room erupt around her, the murmur and shifting of 40 people all reacting at once, and she simply sat very still in the center of it. Then she stood and walked to the table where Charles was already on his feet, organizing papers with the methodical calm he brought to everything. He looked up when she reached him. They were very close in the small space between the tables. She said, because there were no other adequate words, "You did it." "We did it," he said. She put her hand out. He took it and shook it, and then held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, and they looked at each other in the noisy room with the particular attention of two people who are aware that something between them has reached a point where it cannot stay unnamed much longer. Gerald Whitmore left the courthouse without speaking. Douglas Whitmore followed him. They walked out into the street of Harlan Creek and disappeared, and Maude watched them go from the top of the courthouse stairs. "They will not challenge it?" asked. Charles had come to stand beside her. "They could try to appeal," he said, "but I do not think they will. The financial evidence changes their position considerably. I suspect they will want to remove themselves from this town's attention." She nodded slowly. The morning had gone to noon, and the sun was warm on the street, and the mountains were bright above the buildings. "What happens now?" she said. "Now you go home to your ranch," he said. She looked at him sideways. "And you ride back to town to your office." "That is generally what happens after a hearing," he said. "It seems very ordinary," she said, "for an extraordinary morning." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was quieter and warmer than anything he had shown her in the courthouse, without the controlled precision of advocacy, simply himself looking at her in the noon light. "It does," he agreed. She rode home. Perry had stayed to watch the ranch, and he met her in the yard with an expression that told her he had already somehow heard, because Harlan Creek was not a large town and news moved through it at its own particular speed. "Well," he said. "We won," she said. He nodded with the satisfaction of a young man who had correctly assessed a situation. "Good," he said, and took her horse. She stood in the yard of her father's ranch, which was now her ranch, in the full spring afternoon, and she put her hand on the fence post her father had set 30 years ago, and she felt the solid age of it under her palm, and she let herself, finally, breathe. Charles came to the ranch 3 days later, not on business. She knew it when she saw him ride in without the saddlebag full of papers, in a good coat and his hat in his hand when he reached the porch. She had known he was coming. She did not know exactly how she had known, but she had put on the dress she kept for occasions, the blue one, and she had been on the porch when he arrived as though she had simply happened to be there. "I thought I would see how the ranch was settling," he said, and then looked slightly abashed at his own transparently thin excuse. She smiled. She had a good smile, the kind that arrived without preamble. "It is settling well," she said. "Come in." She made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was by now their natural habitat, and for a while they talked about the case, the aftermath, the referral to the territorial attorney, the ordinary business of what came next. But gradually, the conversation moved away from all of that, as conversations do when the formal reason for them has passed, and the real reason has been waiting patiently underneath. He told her about Denver, about the law firm he had worked for there, and the cases that had eventually made it clear to him that the kind of law he wanted to practice was not the kind they were primarily interested in doing. He told her about the 8 months in Harlan Creek and how he had not been sure, coming here, whether this was where he was meant to be, but that he was becoming increasingly sure it was. She told him about what it had been like to grow up on this ranch with her father, the particular education of wide open land and hard work, and a parent who treated her as a person of serious capability, because it had simply never occurred to him to do otherwise. She told him about her mother, who had died when Maude was 18, and whose absence had settled into the ranch like weather, present without being visible. They talked until the afternoon had gone and the lamp was necessary, and at some point during that long afternoon, something that had been building between them for weeks reached a quiet, definitive arrival. Charles set down his coffee cup and looked at her in the lamplight with a directness that was not quite the courtroom variety, more open, more uncertain, more real. "Maude," he said, "I want to say something that is somewhat outside the scope of attorney-client relations." "You are no longer my attorney," she pointed out. "The case is closed." "That is true," he said, and a corner of his mouth moved. "Then say it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I have been coming to this ranch every day for 2 weeks on the basis of professional necessity," he said, "but I think the honest account is that I have been coming here because I wanted to." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "You know," he repeated. "I have been making coffee before you arrive," she said. He absorbed this for a moment. Then he said, with the careful honesty that was simply the way he was made, "I find that I think about you quite a great deal. In the evenings, in the office. In the mornings when I am on the road and the ranch is still a mile away. I find myself looking for reasons to stay later than I should." He paused. "I thought you should know that." She felt something warm and sure move through her, the same quality as the steadiness she had felt in the courtroom, but larger and more personal. "Charles," she said, "I read my father's will in January, and I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was losing this ranch. And then somebody tried to take it from me, and the worst thing turned out to be navigating that entirely alone." She held his gaze. "You made it so I was not alone. That is not a small thing." He was quiet. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, slowly and deliberately, the way he did everything. "I do not want to be in Harlan Creek in the evenings and have you 12 miles away," he said simply. She turned her hand over and held his. "Then do not be," she said. It was not the most elaborate declaration either of them might have imagined, but it was exactly what it needed to be, honest and direct and without surplus ornamentation, which was precisely the nature of both of them. He did not kiss her that evening. He rode back to town at nightfall, and she watched him go from the porch, and neither of them pretended the arrangement was anything other than what it was becoming. He came back the next day. They walked the fence line together in the early evening, which was her evening habit and which he had not done before, and she showed him the ranch the way she knew it, not through the ledgers but through the land itself. She showed him where the Red Bluff Creek bent around the lower pasture, and why that bend mattered for grazing. She showed him the North Ridge where her father had once spent an entire winter building a stone windbreak that had protected cattle in 3 subsequent bad winters. She showed him the place on the east slope where she had gone as a child when she needed to think, a flat shelf of rock with a long view of the valley. They sat there for a while in the cooling evening, side by side on the rock with the valley below them going gold in shadow. The mountains to the west were turning the particular deep purple that only happens for a few minutes at this time of day, and the first stars were beginning to show in the clear sky to the east. "It is very beautiful," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at him, looking at the valley. "Do you think you could like it here?" He turned and met her eyes. The question was about more than the scenery, and they both understood it perfectly. "I already do," he said. He kissed her on the east slope in the last of the evening light, with the valley below them and the stars coming out above, and it was the kind of kiss that does not require any pretense about being something other than what it is, a beginning, clear and warm and decided. They were careful, in the weeks that followed, because this was 1882 in a small Colorado town, and care was both reasonable and required. But the town of Harlan Creek was not without perception, and the frequency of Charles Talbot's rides to the Easton ranch, and the expression on Maude Easton's face when she came to town, became subjects of quiet and generally warm commentary among those who had been present at the hearing, and had formed, in the aftermath, a decided opinion in her favor. Mrs. Colton, whose husband ran the grain supply and who was a woman of considerable social influence in Harlan Creek, was observed to tell at least 3 people that it was about time somebody with sense showed up for that girl. Robert Colton himself shook Charles Talbot's hand one morning outside the general store and said nothing specific, but said it with a great deal of warmth. Perry, at the ranch, continued to ensure that Charles's horse was properly watered and fed, and to find reasons to be elsewhere when they were in the kitchen, which was his version of endorsement. The investigation into Douglas Whitmore's financial records resulted, by early June, in the recovery of the $340 plus accumulated interest, and a formal censure that made his continued presence in Harlan Creek uncomfortable enough that he relocated to Pueblo before summer's end. Gerald Whitmore, his legal position evaporated and his reputation in town significantly diminished, took a job on a spread 2 counties west and did not return. Maude watched both developments with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. With the Whitmore situation resolved, she turned the full considerable force of her attention to the ranch's spring operations, and Charles, whose law practice was building steadily from his office in town, fell into the rhythm of a man who spends his professional days in one place and his free evenings in another, and finds the evenings increasingly the place that feels like home. He asked her to marry him in July on the East Slope Rock in the evening, which was where it was always going to happen. He had been working up to it for 2 weeks, which she had known, because he had been slightly less articulate than usual in the evenings, which was how she could tell he was thinking about something large. He said, sitting beside her with his elbows on his knees and looking at the valley, that he had spent a year and a half practicing law in Harlan Creek, and in that time, the most significant thing that had happened to him was walking into his office one morning and finding Maude Easton in the chair across from his desk, and that the most frightening thing he could currently imagine was a future in which she was not the person he came home to. He looked at her when he said it, steady and clear, with no artifice and no theater. She put her hand on his face and said yes before he had quite finished the question. They were married in September of 1882 in the small white church at the edge of Harlan Creek, on a morning that was bright and cool with the first edge of autumn in the air. Maude wore her mother's lace collar over a dress the color of good cream, and Charles stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he was making toward without knowing it for some time. Perry stood for Charles, scrubbed clean and considerably uncomfortable in a good suit. Mrs. Colton sat in the front row with 3 of her friends and wept freely and with great satisfaction. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall, and Harlan Creek turned out with the enthusiasm of a town that has been waiting for something genuinely good to happen and is glad when it does. There was food that people had been cooking since the previous day, and music from a fiddle player and a man with a harmonica, and the afternoon went long and warm and full. Maude danced with her husband for the first time in front of the whole of Harlan Creek, which seemed, collectively, to approve. Charles proved to be a careful dancer, precise in his footwork in the same way he was precise about everything, but there was a quality to dancing with him that Maude recognized. He paid complete attention, and when you were the object of that attention you felt the full weight of it, warm and encompassing. "You are going to have to learn to be less thorough," she told him during a slow waltz. "About dancing," he said. "About everything," she said, and she was smiling. "I can try," he said. He pulled her slightly closer. "I doubt I will succeed." She laughed and put her head briefly against his shoulder, and around them the fiddle played and the afternoon went gold through the church hall windows. They went home to the Easton Ranch, which was now the Talbot Ranch, though Maude kept the Easton name on the gate because her father had built it and the name deserved to stay. Charles never suggested otherwise. The first winter of their marriage was a working one. Charles maintained his law office in town, riding the 12 miles each way on the better days and staying in town on the worse ones. in the room above his office that they kept for that purpose. Maude ran the ranch with Perry and two new hands she had hired in October, a brother and sister, Samuel and Dora Crane, who were young and willing, and who Maude trained with the same directness her father had used on her. She found that she liked teaching. She had not expected that, had not known that showing another person how to read a cattle brand or understand a water rights document would carry the same satisfaction as doing it herself. But it did, because it multiplied the thing, made it larger than one pair of hands. Dora Crane had a sharp mind for figures, and Maude recognized in her the same kind of competence that the world was inclined to overlook because of the form it arrived in. She made a point of telling Dora plainly that her figures were good and her instincts about cattle were sound, because she knew better than most people what it cost a person to go unacknowledged. She told Charles about this one evening, and he listened with the attentive quality she had come to think of as the best thing about him, not simply the willingness to hear, but the genuine interest in what was being said. "You are a good teacher," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said. He knew she meant her father, and he said nothing further, just reached across and took her hand the way he did when he understood that the moment did not need words. The winter was cold, and the spring following was wet, and the summer of 1883 was hard in the way that summers in Colorado Territory could be hard, dry and relentless, and demanding daily vigilance over the water supply. Maude managed it with the steady competence of someone who has been watching this land for 24 years and knows its rhythms even when the rhythms are ungenerous. By midsummer of 1883, she knew she was expecting a child. She told Charles on the east slope, in the evening, which was where they went when something important needed to be said. He sat very still for a moment after she told him, and then he put his arms around her with a gentleness that was also fierce, the way emotion gets when a person is very glad and also slightly frightened, and he pressed his forehead against her hair and said, quietly and with complete seriousness, that he was going to be the most present and attentive father in the Colorado Territory. "You will read the child law books," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "Only the relevant ones," he said. Their son was born in March of 1884. It was a long birth, attended by the doctor from town and by Mrs. Colton, who had appointed herself to be useful in a crisis, and Charles spent most of the night on the far side of the bedroom door in a state of controlled suffering that Mrs. Colton later described to her husband as almost painful to witness. The baby was born before dawn, healthy and loud, with the round, astonished face of a person who has recently arrived somewhere unexpected and is forming opinions about it. They named him Franklin Charles Talbot, for a grandfather who had believed in his daughter and a father who had stood up in a courtroom and told the truth about her. Charles held the baby in the kitchen in the thin early morning light, with his shirt still slightly untucked from the night's vigil, looking down at this small new person with an expression that was entirely unguarded, unlawyered, simply a man encountering something that exceeded his usual frameworks. Maude watched him from the bed where she was propped on pillows, exhausted and warm and full of a happiness that was different from any happiness she had known before, larger and quieter and more serious. "He has your eyes," she said. Charles looked up. "He has your determination," he said. "I can already tell. He has been alive for 40 minutes, she said. "It is already apparent," he said, and looked back down at the baby with a smile that she filed carefully away in the part of her memory reserved for things she never wanted to forget. Franklin Charles Talbot grew into exactly the kind of child that two such parents might produce, curious and stubborn, and possessed of a startling early ability to identify when an argument had a logical flaw, which made the dinner table occasionally challenging and consistently entertaining. Maude taught him to ride before he was 4 and to read before he was 5, in the same order her father had taught her, because she believed in the same hierarchy of knowledges. Charles read to him in the evenings with a selection that ranged broadly across the available literature and occasionally veered, as Maude had predicted, into legal history, though he kept it to the more compelling cases. In the summer of 1886, their daughter was born. They named her Eleanor for Charles's mother, and she arrived in the world with the efficient speed of a second child, and the same dark eyes as her father and the same set to her jaw as her mother, which was noted by Mrs. Colton, who was present again, with great satisfaction. The ranch grew in those years. Maude expanded the cattle operation carefully and well, adding acreage through a neighboring land purchase in 1885, and improving the water management along the creek in ways that increased the grazing capacity of the lower pasture measurably. Charles's law practice grew also, and by 1886 he had taken on a junior associate, a young man named Thomas Reed who had studied law in St. Louis, and who shared Charles's conviction that the law was supposed to actually do something useful. Perry remained at the ranch through all of it, rising from hand to foreman with the steady inevitability of someone who simply never stops doing excellent work. He was 28 by 1886 and had recently married Dora Crane, the sharply capable young woman Maude had hired and trained, and who had, in the years of daily proximity, found in Perry a man who appreciated her competence in the same straightforward way she appreciated his. Maude had watched this develop with the pleasure of someone who has been waiting for two sensible people to notice each other, and is glad when they finally do. The ranch had 4 full-time hands by 1887 and a good, established rhythm, and Maude moved through her days with the particular satisfaction of a person who has built something solid from materials that someone else tried to take away. There were still moments, occasional and unpredictable, when she would stand at the fence post her father had set and put her hand on it and feel the full weight of how close she had come to losing it all. She did not dwell in those moments, but she did not dismiss them either. They reminded her of things worth knowing. She told Charles about them, because she told Charles most things by that point, which was one of the primary advantages of being married to someone who was genuinely interested in what you had to say. "I think about the judge," she said one evening, not with anger, just the awareness of how much that one morning mattered if the court had ruled differently. "It did not," he said, "because you were there. Because the evidence was there," he said. "I simply made sure it was seen." She looked at him. They were at the kitchen table, as they so often were in the evenings, with the lamp between them and the children asleep upstairs and the night settled over the ranch outside. "You know that is not the whole truth," she said. He considered this with the intellectual honesty she had always found in him. "I know that I wanted very much to win," he said. "More than I have wanted to win most cases." "Because of your mother," she said. A pause. "Yes," he said, "and because of you." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. They sat in the lamplight while the clock on the shelf ticked and the fire crackled low in the stove, and outside the ranch was quiet under the Colorado night, the mountains dark against a sky dense with stars. In 1888, they were asked to speak at a meeting of the Territorial Bar Association in Denver on the subject of property rights in contested estate cases. Charles had been asked to speak, and he had, without particularly consulting Maude about it, sent a letter back saying that he would attend with his wife, and that they would both be presenting, because the case that had made his reputation in the territory was as much her case as his, and she should be there to tell it. Maude read the letter after he sent it and felt something move through her that was composed equally of exasperation at being committed without consultation and of a deep, uncomplicated love for the man who had done it. "You could have asked me first," she said. "Would you have said no?" he said. She thought about it. "No," she admitted. "I was conserving time," he said, and looked at her with that slight, contained amusement he deployed when he knew he was right and is being somewhat roguish about it. She went to Denver. They rode the train with Franklin, who was 4 and had a great deal of opinions about the train, and Eleanor, who was 2 and fell asleep in Charles's arms before they reached the first mountain tunnel and did not wake until Denver. At the Bar Association meeting, Maude stood before a room of lawyers, the large majority of them men, and spoke plainly and without apology about the nature of her father's estate, the Whitmore petition, and what it had meant to stand in a courtroom and be told that the words commonly used to describe women's incapacity had no evidential basis. She spoke about what it had been like to read that notice on the post outside the bank, and to understand that her entire life's work was under question not because she had done anything wrong, but because a court could be asked to simply assume she was not equipped. The room was very quiet while she spoke. She said that the law, at its best, was not in the business of assuming. She said the law, at its best, required that words be supported. She said that every word used against her in that petition had been wrong, and that a good lawyer and a fair judge had together established that, and she was glad, genuinely glad, that both had existed in Harlan Creek in the spring of 1882. She got a long and somewhat surprised silence after she finished, and then the kind of applause that comes from a room that is processing something it did not expect to find moving. Charles spoke after her and made the legal argument with his customary precision and thoroughness, and afterward a number of young lawyers came to speak with both of them, and several of the conversations were with lawyers who were handling cases that bore similarities to Maude's, women whose inheritances were being contested, whose competence was being challenged by assumption rather than evidence, and Charles gave each of them his card and told them to write, which several of them did. They came home to Harlan Creek on the train in the evening with 2 sleeping children and the particular bone tiredness of people who have done something that mattered and used themselves up doing it. Charles had Franklin against his shoulder, and Maude had a leaner in her lap, and the train rocked through the mountains in the dark, and Maude leaned her head back against the seat and looked at the stars out the window. "You were extraordinary," Charles said, quietly so as not to wake the children. "You built the case," she said. "You lived it," he said. She looked at him across the sleeping children, her husband in the lamplight of the train car with their son asleep against his shoulder, and she thought about the morning she had walked into his office with a folded notice in her pocket and no certainty of anything except that she was not going to let them take it without a fight. She had not known then that the fight would give her everything she had not known to ask for. "Charles," she said. He said, not quite sleepy but not far from it. "I am very glad you had that office," she said. He opened his eyes fully and looked at her, and the look was the same as it had always been, complete and present and genuinely there. "So am I," he said. The train rocked through the mountains and the stars were immense and the children slept, and Maude Easton, who was Maude Talbot now though she still sometimes thought of herself by both names, allowed herself a rare and complete contentment, the kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge of what difficulty has built. The ranch was waiting for them when they returned, solid and real. The fence post her father had set still standing in the Colorado earth, the creek running clear along the lower pasture, the mountains holding the same positions they always had. She walked out to the fence on the first morning back, as she always did, while the house was still waking behind her, and she put her hand on the post and stood in the early light. She thought about her father. She thought about Gerald Whitmore reading that notice on the post. She thought about sitting in a hard chair in front of a judge in a room full of people who were waiting to see what would happen. She thought about a man in a back-room office with his sleeves rolled up and his attention fully on her, who had said without hesitation, "I know," when she had told him she was of sound judgment. She heard the back door of the house open and the sound of Charles's step on the porch, and then the voices of the children, Franklin's already asking something that required an explanation, Alina making the sound she made in the mornings that was not quite a word and not quite a song. She heard Charles answering Franklin's question with patient thoroughness, which Franklin was going to push against until it satisfied him, which might take some time. She smiled with her hand on the fence post and the light growing gold around her. The mountains were clear. The cattle were moving on the lower pasture. The creek was running. She had fought for this place and she had won it, and she had built a life in it that was larger and warmer than she had known to hope for. On the morning she had unfolded a notice and felt something cold settle in her chest. The cold had gone. It had been replaced by something that was, in its quiet and daily and reliable way, the most solid thing she had ever known. Charles came off the porch with a leaner on his hip and Franklin trotting beside him, and he crossed the yard to where Maude was standing at the fence. And when he reached her, he did not say anything for a moment, just stood beside her with their daughter on his hip and the morning around them, looking out at the land with the same attention he gave everything. Then Franklin tugged his sleeve and said, "Papa, what is a water right and why does it matter?" And Charles, because he was who he was, began explaining, carefully and thoroughly, standing in the yard of the ranch that had been fought for and won, with the mountains behind him and his wife at his side. Maude listened to him explain water rights to a 4-year-old and found that it was, improbably and completely, her favorite sound in the world. She turned back to the mountains, to the fence, to the land that bore her father's name and her own will, and she breathed the Colorado morning in and thought, without irony and without reservation, that this was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The Easton ranch endured. It grew. It was worked by careful hands and managed by a clear mind and sat at the end of a dirt road off the Red Bluff Creek for decades more. Its fence posts slowly replaced as the old ones weathered. Its books kept in the same meticulous hand that had first proven itself in a courtroom in the spring of 1882. And on the gate, through all of it, the name Easton remained, because Maude had put it there and it was hers, and no one was ever going to take it down.